this next piece, this is a modified from what I stuck up on my blog. And the reason I did this piece was because I started thinking about the fact that since I wrote that book, mostly what has occupied my mind has been the idea, like I said before, that sex is a metaphor for the pleasures of reading and writing. And so this is what I talk to everyone about all the time. But there's a huge, the novel is called Sex and Death in the American Novel. There's another entire piece that I don't talk about, right? And that is the grief and what happens when somebody dies and you don't think you're handling it right. Let's see if I just said it. I was terrified when the events I describe here first happened. I was terrified of what they meant, terrified that anyone would find out that my father didn't want me, and had been terrified for months afterward that there was something wrong with me. Every time I tell this story, I get a bit more clarity, a bit more assurance that I am just as messed up as everyone else. No more, no less. And the fear that first surrounded this incident with my father and admitting to the feelings I experienced after his death become each time a little bit less powerful. And this is the darkest piece, and then, like I promised, I will do a nice fun one at the end. The core of what I was trying to get to in my book was this one particular aspect of grief. When my mother passed in October of 2006, I hardly wrote at all and therefore didn't examine much about the situation. I still scribbled notes and story ideas or little snippets of observation, and I did a small amount of journaling, but mostly I was busy trying to deal with a constant crippling exhaustion and spent any coherent thought time trying to figure out why I was so tired all the time. I don't actually remember much about those months except trying to pull off a birthday party for my daughter and knowing deep down in my bones that I was a horrible mother because I did not want to do it. I did not. Even as I hung streamers and smiled at people when they came over to help her celebrate her second year on Earth. What got me out of bed and back to my life was deciding that we needed a new place to live. 6 months after my mother died, I threw myself into managing all the details that go into finding a house and making a move. I want to add that I spent a good chunk of the time when my mother was alive hating her, cutting her off, avoiding her phone calls, trying to protect the sanity and drama-free life I was trying to hold together. I would change my phone number and avoid stopping by her house when I would go back to visit friends. While she was able to express love, she was also able to express rage, and just a look or exhalation over the phone lines could provoke a deep fear, anxiety, and a sense of impending doom that took weeks to shake off. Many people knew her will agree, my mother could be scary. She could also be the most charming woman on the planet. I spent much of my life running away and hiding, then missing her and coming back. I joked with friends that she looked like Jack Nicholson, though this was not actually far from the truth. One of my clearest memories is of the first time she had to be locked up. I was 11. She followed me through my grandmother's house in the middle of the night, quoting passages from the book, I'm Okay, You're Okay. I had just seen The Shining, and from then on, always thought of her and Jack as being the same person in some cosmic realm. They both had crazy eyes, short dark hair that stuck out in greasy wisps. They both chased people down long hallways in those jeans that didn't quite fit right on the hips. In my mother's case, because she wore men's jeans and filled the front pockets with what seemed like pounds of coins, keys, and small bits of hardware. She took a long time to die. Even at her weakest, she was still manipulative, still capable of stirring up so much trouble. By the end, though, I had spent enough time with her to feel like I had made amends for some of the horrors I had inflicted on her as a teenager, and done what needed to be done to keep her hometown from ending up on City Confidential. In the months after I quit my job to go back and help her move into a new home, I was able to talk to her in ways that were not possible when she was more energetic and focused on all of her many wheelings and dealings. She liked to collect guns and stuff like that. We were okay when she died, and it was a matter of pride that when the hospice worker had us all do the last formal meeting, she just looked at me and said, I don't have much to say to you. She looked at me with those tired, puffy eyes, the thin-lipped, lopsided grin, and there was a softness in her voice that I've craved since earliest childhood. I was there when she directed her eyes to a specific spot on the ceiling, a definite action, as if her head were pulled by an unseen thread. I watched the color leave her face, and I went running for the nurse, as if she could do something, as if she wasn't sitting downstairs doing paperwork, oblivious to the bugger I had rung so many times from my mother's room. I grieved for my mother, and I grieve still. I see her in old, broken people hooked up to oxygen tanks, or wheeling around on scooters with dogs tied to the side. But when I see these people, I feel a longing and appreciation for what I had. The anger is long gone. When my father died more than 3 years later, in March of 2010, I expected the same basic experience. He had a few years to deteriorate as well, though in his case, he had a wife to look after him. She would call every so often to ask me to stay with him while she took a much-needed break. And as I told you before, we drove around the state of North Carolina and I looked at old vacation spots. We'd listen to Neil Diamond or Don Williams, both of whom would send him into fits and smiles, saying, "Thank you, thank you." I was at last able to redeem myself from the screw-up I always represented for him. He told me once while I drove us toward the sunset that he thought he should not have left my mother, and that he should have been a better father. I hope that meant he regretted keeping me in Straight, which was a radical drug treatment center popular in the 80s and 90s, for months after it was obvious that the place was so wrong, but he never did admit that. I was sure we were good, even though I resented the awards on his wall that he had received for working with troubled youth. During the exact same time, my sisters and I were calling to report my mother's latest split from reality. After I began running away from home, after my trip to California, after Straight, we were never able to really talk in the honest and pure way we had when I was younger. When he lost his mind, it seemed that I had my daddy back, and we could just be together. Though sometimes we would still do it, most of the time there was no need to talk, just to listen to music and look at the passing scenery in the car, or watch King Kong, Star Wars, or Superman and remember better times. 2 weeks before he died, I went out to see him. He stopped eating and drinking, then recovered some when the hospital rehydrated him and sent him back to the rest home. I spent a pleasant couple of days reading to him and watching old movies until the afternoon he sent me away with a firm shake of his head. My father could say as much with his eyes as my mother could, and I knew he wanted me to leave him alone. I was devastated. I wanted to be with him as I had with my mother. He didn't want me. I flew home and did my best to forget it. I did a lot of crying. Several days later, my stepmother called to say that he had again stopped eating, and the nurses this time were not going to do anything to revive him. My sister and uncle flew out as well. This time, when I talked to my father, I asked him if he remembered how I was as a little child. He acknowledged me with a tear that slipped from his eye and a hitching gasp for breath, and continued to look at me. Then he swiveled his head toward a spot on the ceiling, as if his attention had been pulled there by something I couldn't see, just as my mother had done. My sister came around to the other side of the bed. She talked to him and told him it was okay to go. She told him that he had seen everyone there was to see. She then told me that we should leave. He is an introvert. He would not want us here for this. Of course she was right. I was grateful in that moment for her wisdom, for her being there when I so obviously had no clue how to handle him. When someone called the next morning to deliver the news that he had passed, all the random bits of things started to happen. We drove to the rest home, to the funeral home, and God knows where else that day. A few people worked on his obituary and made calls. I drove back to the home to collect more stuff. And when I was busy, I did in some ways feel like I had when my mother passed. A weird energy pervaded everything. I had no parents left and I was alone. Alone like when I landed at LAX a month after my 14th birthday. I was on my own for the first time, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. I was also angry with my father. I was fully aware of how selfish it was. He was the one who died and the one who had suffered. Still, I began to build a case against him. I thought of how he sent me away, how he tried to keep me in Straight, how he'd spent precious hours with strangers' kids while his youngest slid into drug addiction and criminal behavior, how he had utterly and completely failed my mother, How different this was from the way I viewed my parents when they were alive. My mother, the crazy, the evil. My father, the saint who tried to hold the family together until he had to go out and save himself. To make matters worse, I began to focus on the people around me and how inadequate they were. My husband had no sincere words of comfort, and I can tell by his tone of voice on the phone that he just wanted me to come home and get back to normal. My stepmother and her family seemed to be trying to act as if nothing had happened and continued to have dinner parties and talk about their jobs and vacations as if my father's dying were old news. I couldn't get the thoughts out of my head. I made harsh judgments that I knew were not fair. I tallied in my mind every way everyone had failed me and my father, how stupid and idiotic absolutely everything they said was. When I couldn't stand it anymore, I went to the beach. And in a cheery enough hotel room, it sunk in how unprepared I was for this new way of handling death. With my mother, I had been irritable. I probably even took out my frustrations on a few inanimate objects. But that did not come close to this consuming rage, this active hate, this scary new me. The anger at my father is not gone, though I love it when I catch sight of old guys who has dad's same pancake butt. I ogle the butts of old men because I miss my father. Part of me knows that no matter what, I was a disappointment to him, and I am angry with both of us for this. My mother constantly complained of his inability to engage. Maybe this was just him, and the distance I felt had very little to do with me. Often I think about him in ways that are more logical, more fair, more pragmatic. But hatred is once in a while still satisfying. I spent a large amount of energy trying to justify my feelings to myself, as if there were some psychic committee I had to explain circumstances to. So the thing I always try to explain about grief, and I wish I could prepare other people for, is the way we can beat ourselves up for not doing it the way we think we should. I want people to know how totally futile that is. One of the things I tried to work out in the writing of my novel was the question of how I could hate a dead person, especially someone I loved. Death has proven to be so much more complicated than I would have ever expected. Even if I was sure I was doing it wrong, in the end, I was able to process it best when I simply let it be all that it wanted to be, this fucking monster in my heart, which goes by such a puny name, grief.